Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Second Story Press event. Thank you for tuning in from Middle Grade Magic. We're so glad you could join us. I'm Gillian Rodgerson, the managing editor of Second Story Press, and today I'll be joined by award-winning author Kathy Kacer. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you. Really happy to be here.
Wherever you're tuning in from, we're thrilled that you can join us, and we'll get started shortly. All of us are situated on different territories, but the women of Second Story Press would like to acknowledge the ancestral lands on which we work and live. The building that houses our office at 20 Maud Street in Toronto is situated in traditional territories, including those of the Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabeg, Métis, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We at Second Story have been privileged to work with Indigenous authors, illustrators, editors, and other collaborators in our publishing house. And we hope that the books that we produce here can in some way contribute to the reconciliation process in our country. We'd like to work with more Indigenous creators, editors, and educators, and we're committed to making those connections happen. Before I get started, I have a few small details to go over. The format today will include a discussion between Kathy and me. And at the end of the discussion, there'll be time for some questions and answers from the audience, if there are any. So type your questions in anytime during the event, and we'll get to them at the end. And I do encourage you to ask questions and drop comments as we go. Let us know where you're tuning in from, and we'd love to hear. Also, if you're unable to hear us, please comment and let us know. Okay, now on to the main event. Kathy Kacer's books have won a number of awards, including the Silver Birch and the Jewish Book Award. A former psychologist, Kathy now travels the globe speaking to children and adults about the importance of keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive. Her most recent novel is Under the Iron Bridge, published in the fall of 2021. And Second Story is also publishing her forthcoming middle grade novel, Hidden on the High Wire, which you can look forward to in the fall of 2022. Kathy lives in Toronto with her family. So, Kathy, welcome. You've written more than 24 books, and yet this is your second career. You started as a psychologist. Did you always want to write, or was there a particular story that you felt you had to tell?
Well, I guess the answer to that is yes to both. I always wrote as a kid. I wrote poetry and songs and short stories and really bad comic strips because I can't draw. And, just wrote, I had a journal for years and years. I still have copies of my journals that I wrote
Wow.
when I know, in elementary school. So the answer is yes, I always wanted to write. I went into psychology because that was just a really interesting area for me to explore. I didn't really think about a career as a writer in those early days. But more and more, as I was getting older, I felt compelled to go back to the writing. And yes, I had a story that I wanted to tell. I'm the child of Holocaust survivors, and I really wanted to write a story about my mother, who had passed away before that, and about her experience of hiding during the Second World War. And that, of course, became my very first book with Second Story Press, The Secret of Gabby's Dresser.
So when you're writing these stories, does your background in psychology help you when you portray your characters' feelings and motivations? You seem to understand so clearly how these people must have felt. Does that come from stories from your parents or from your own understanding?
Again, I'd say the answer is yes to both. As far as my career goes, and whether that the career as a psychologist and whether that influences the writing that I do today, I think the answer is probably yes, though I couldn't tell you how. I was a psychologist for more than 20 years, and whatever that ability is, or whatever that intuition is in me, I think just kind of seeps into the writing that I do in some kind of way that I don't fully understand. So yes, I think it must influence me. And yes, my parents and my mother in particular talked so openly about her experiences during that time, that terrible time. And I always say that she must have had some innate sensitivity about how much to tell me at each stage of my development, because of course I grew up quite passionate about this history and of course wanting to write it down. And so I think her voice of telling me this history somehow finds its way into my writing as well.
It's interesting you say that, because I was going to ask you, I mean, do you have to sort of juggle depending on the age group that you're writing for? I know you write for younger children and for older teens and young readers, and I wondered, how do you decide how much detail and how much trauma is appropriate for each age group?
Yeah, that's always a balancing act, Gillian. It's always something that I'm sort of contending with. And I do rely on my editors to help me with that decision making as well. But I will say that over the years, the only way I can explain is to say that over the years, I've developed what I refer to as my sort of Holocaust radar. Okay. And as I'm writing for a particular age group, I am just thinking constantly, is this enough? Is this too much? Should I add more? And because my books, as you said, span from probably about age 8 to 18, you know, I am always thinking about how brutal, if you will, how stark, how clear the information needs to be, and how much is too much. And I know, and we all know, that information that is too graphic too soon will deter young people from wanting to read more. Mm-hmm. And that's always my goal, wanting kids to read more. So I think I'll just continue to work on that and balance that going forward.
Yeah, because I mean, you can certainly cover very difficult topics for any age range, because goodness knows kids live those things. They're not too young to live those things. So I guess that is something that in children's literature we always have to be balancing.
Well, and that's the truth as well. And sadly, over time, kids are contending with more and more trauma as far as the world is concerned: war, genocide, oppression, anti-Semitism, on and on and on. So it's not whether or not we provide this information, but it's always how we provide it, in what form, and what will encourage kids to, to engage in a meaningful way with this material.
Yeah, that's a really a good attitude to take. So let's talk about your most recent book, Under the Iron Bridge. It's the story of a group of kids that many of us hadn't heard of before. So can you tell us about the Edelweiss Pirates, and why was it important to you to tell their story?
Yeah, what a remarkable group of kids, the Edelweiss Pirates. First of all, just the name alone is fantastic. I think as soon as I read that, I thought, oh, that's something I have to write. The name is just too great. Mm-hmm. So as you said, they were a group of teenage resistance fighters between the ages of 14 and 17 in Germany before and during the Second World War. They were completely opposed to everything that Adolf Hitler stood for. They rejected the Hitler Youth, which was the mandatory organization that Hitler had established, trying to groom future young people to be future soldiers in his army, future Nazis. They rejected all of that. They started out kind of as a social group, but over time became more defiant in their actions. They made armed raids on military depots. They stole explosives and provided them to other resistance groups. They provided refuge to escapees from concentration camps and labor camps. So I loved the notion of young people coming together to do something so heroic at that dangerous time in history. I mean, the consequences for being caught doing what they were doing were so extreme. Yeah. Some were imprisoned, some were even hanged for their actions. And yet these young people really, followed their that moral compass, vowing to do something good, vowing to stand up for their neighbors who were in need, vowing to demonstrate that kind of compassion that was so needed at that time. And all of those reasons made them the perfect subject for a book. I really just wanted to show young people doing something so good at a time when people were turning away from Jews and turning away from what was right. So
and I think that's significant. They were teenagers. They were they were not adults. And the other thing that's significant, excuse me, about most of the Edelweiss pirates is that they weren't Jewish. A lot of the anti-Semitism, a lot of the horror that their Jewish neighbors were facing wasn't directed at them. And yet they took a stand. And I think, tell me about Paul, about the main character in the book.
So Paul is a fictional character. I never met any of the members of the Edelweiss Pirates. There is a small social organization that still exists in Europe, the Edelweiss Pirates. I think they're mostly descendants of those original members. I really wanted to sort of create somebody who would represent that kind of young person, that kind of Jewish, non-Jewish German boy, raised in a decent family, grappling with right and wrong at that time, and making that courageous decision to do something right, not to go along with the crowd, not to follow the orders of those people around him. And as I said, despite the dangers, just making this decision to do something good at that time. So I really wanted to kind of hold him up as an example of what was possible at that time. Certainly there were not enough people like Paul, not enough rescuers, but he's a wonderful example of what was possible. And yes, you're right. I mean, I've written a number of books about other rescuers, but they were all adults. And usually in the cases of my books, adults who were rescuing younger people who I had created in those books. But these were young people themselves. So what fabulous role models I think they serve for young people who are reading this book, showing again what was possible at that time.
I know it's such a wonderful story. It's so terrific. It has kind of adventure and excite, even though the underlying reasons for the adventure are so horrible, but you have managed to build in kind of some they do sort of daring things, and there's a little bit of completely age appropriate romance.
Yes, always good for a teenage book.
We won't give too much away there,
no.
But and this story, I mean, I know the books that you write are based on history, and yet the characters are mostly fictional, although not always. And can you tell us about the research that you do? How do you approach writing a book when you decide what story you want to tell?
Well, I've been researching this history for so many years, so I feel like I live in a world of research. I am constantly reading books about that time in history, both books written for young people and books written for adults. I'm constantly on the internet searching for moments in history that I might want to write about, or people that I might want to write about. I'm constantly speaking to young people, so I'm getting their input on what they also want to read about this time in history. And I have had the privilege over the years to interview dozens and dozens of Holocaust survivors. And I've written many books about them, about those individuals. And I always say it's such a privilege because that community of survivors is aging and passing away, and soon their voices will be gone completely. So I love to speak with survivors. I love to talk about their histories and really peel back the layers of their lives. So even if I'm not writing about an individual in my book, I think every one of the characters, every one of the fictional characters in my book is based on somebody I've met. is based on a survivor who I've spoken to, or a member of my family who was a survivor, or somebody that I've read about who I've had the privilege of meeting as well. So I infuse my stories with all of those realistic characteristics and elements and voices that I surround myself with on a daily basis.
And what kind of, I mean, when you go out to share your books with audiences, and what kind of reactions do you get? Do you have you shared them with survivors? I'm sure you have.
I do. I mean, I speak with survivors all the time. When I've written specifically about survivors in the books that I've written, I usually give the survivor a copy of the manuscript before it even goes into publication, so that they can read it and make sure that they stand behind what I've written. And they are really my litmus test. If a survivor can say to me, yes, this is an accurate representation of what happened to me at that time, then I'm fine. I don't worry about any other feedback but that. And when I go out to speak with kids, I mean, we know that kids are drawn first and foremost to stories. And if we give them a good story that, as you said, is compelling and adventuresome and has elements of all the things that kids love to read about, then they will engage with that story. Mm-hmm. And the history will come along. They will learn something in the process, whether they intended to or not. They will, they'll glean something about that time in history. But I always think about story first, and history moving its way in and through the story as I'm writing. And so the reaction I get from kids is that they usually love the stories. They're engaged with the stories. They're intrigued with what I've been writing, and I always have kids saying that they're going to be reading it for sure if they haven't already, and educators who say they're bringing them into their classrooms if they haven't already. And, that's the best response I could ask for.
That's so exciting. And especially now, since, I mean, sadly, in Toronto where we are, and I would bet in other places, there have been numerous incidences of anti-Semitism in the schools recently. There's been graffiti, there's been hate speech. And so books like yours are so important now. Is there a message that you want to give through your books? Is there something specific that you think that your books maybe can do to address this?
It's a really good question. I don't often speak out directly against anti-Semitism, although it's a given that it's horrible and shouldn't be around. And I'm disheartened and just so saddened when there are those incidents still happening today. I mean, after all, have we learned nothing in all of these years? It's a question I keep asking. But my approach is to keep telling stories that tell a different story. So my approach is to keep bringing stories of rescuers into the public eye. My approach is to keep telling, positive stories of individuals who refused to fall under the spell of then Adolf Hitler and others who have emerged over time. I want to tell those positive stories. And I think that can do a lot to stem hatred, to, curtail the activities of those who think it's, I don't know what, cool to be drawing swastikas on buildings or whatever their intention is. Let's talk about those who did something good at a time in history. Let's use those examples in the classroom and in our communities and in playgrounds and everywhere else.
And I think when you give kids these specific stories, and they can see people, in their story who they might identify with for whatever reason, the human connections, it makes the Holocaust real. It makes it not just some abstract event from history. And I think that's a good tactic as well.
I think if there, if there's any message, and when I speak to educators, I do talk about this. It's it's challenging young people to think about who they want to be in this world and what do they want to stand up for.
Yeah.
So I don't expect kids, and I God pray that kids will never, our community will never have to go to war. There are kids, of course, around the world who are forced to do that. But there's so many things that kids can do positive in their communities. So let's work with kids to bring those out. Let's keep using examples of that kind of goodness. And let's hope that that attitude starts to prevail more and more.
I hope so. And your next book, Hidden on the High Wire, is another inspiring story about, oh my gosh, I love this one. Tell the people watching a little bit about what they can expect.
Yeah, so, this is again an example of every time I think I've written the last book I'm going to write about this history, another remarkable story comes along and I say to myself, I've got to write that one.
Absolutely.
So Hidden Under the High Wire is based on the story of a circus performer whose name was Irene Danner. Irene Danner was a young Jewish girl at that time during the Second World War. Who came from this long line of Jewish circus performers. I mean, in my community, that's almost amusing to say Jewish circus performer. I'm not sure anybody would be caught dead doing what she was doing. She was an acrobat. She performed on the high wire. Her relatives were all circus performers. That Jewish circus was forced to close down, as were all Jewish businesses before the war. And Irene and her family, I won't explain all the details, but were forced to kind of go into hiding. And then she approached another circus owner, a man by the name of Adolf Althoff. And he ran a circus called the Althoff Circus in Germany at that time, also a famous circus. And Irene and her family came to live at the Althoff Circus and were hidden there, performing, under sort of assumed names, were hidden there during the war. And Althoff is the person who kept them safe. And this circus was searched by the Gestapo numerous times. And there were all kinds of things that were done to sort of hide Irene and her family at that time. But they did remain safe during the war, thanks to the efforts of another heroic rescuer, Mr. Althoff, who saved this family in his circus.
I know, it's an amazing story. How did you come across it?
Again, I think it sort of harkens back to the research that I do. I'm constantly reading about this history, of course, and going down whatever rabbit holes I can find to discover more and more about stories that I may not have heard about. And somewhere along the line, the story of Irene Danner and the Althoff Circus popped up on some site that I was searching. And of course, just piqued my interest. I started to read more and more about them and what was involved in that, in Irene's life and hiding. And once again thought, this is another remarkable story that needs to be told.
I know, it's amazing. I love this book. So I hope that everybody will look for it in the fall. So obviously you have such enthusiasm and fascination for your subject and for your audience and for telling these stories. What's your favorite thing about being a writer for young people?
Oh gosh, so many things. First of all, I never imagined that my history would be the thing that I would be now doing as a writer. I grew up as the child of Holocaust survivors, immersed in the stories that my parents and my relatives told. So to be able to bring that history now through my stories to young people is more than I ever dreamed about. I am constantly amazed that I've written, as you said, more than 24 books, and young people are reading them around the world. And I'm also leaving this legacy for my children, these books, and maybe one day my grandchildren and so on. That's quite incredible to me. So I love that. Just the whole image of what I'm doing and what it's meant to be, meant to me. And then I think, when I'm actually writing, when I'm in the middle of a book and I am completely immersed in the characters that I'm writing and the story that I'm trying to tell, and I'm living through those characters in my brain. I'm reciting dialogue in my brain. I have notebooks all over the house where I jot things down so I won't forget them, so I can bring them back to my desk to write. When I'm in the middle of a book and doing that writing, that's my happy time. That's my happy place, and really the best part of what I do. The rewriting is a little bit more difficult, but the first time around is really always a joy for me. I'm not the only author to say that rewriting is hard. Going back and redoing and rethinking and rejigging and all that stuff can be more onerous. But
I don't think there's any author that enjoys that, and I don't think. I mean, as an editor, that's one of the things that is so. One of the most difficult, perhaps, parts of my job is communicating notes and things to authors in a way that it's helpful to them, and trying to say, look, I love this story. I love this book. I want it to be great. So don't take this the wrong way.
And on my end, I have to constantly tell myself, we all, editors, publishers, myself, we all have the best interests of the book in mind.
Exactly.
So this will make it better. This will make it better. I keep saying that to myself. This will make it better. So just do the work that you have to do, and we'll have a great product at the end of it all.
And then the book's done, and we all get to be cheerleaders for it, and it's the best.
And then I get to look at these beautiful covers that are being designed, and think about titles for books and all of that wonderful stuff. So
that's the fun bit.
That is the fun bit. That's definitely the fun bit.
What's coming up next?
Well, there's always more stories. And there are a couple that I'm playing with right now. You will be hearing about them, no doubt.
Can't wait.
Yes. So yeah, there are a couple more stories that I want to tell, and probably more down the road as well. I want to write a play. That I wrote a play with my son a few years ago called Therefore Choose Life. And I'm thinking in my head that I have a play that I want to write as well. So that's going to be something I will do in the next little while.
In collaboration with your son again, or are you going to go out on your own this time?
I think I'm going to do this one on my own, although he is a great person to bounce ideas off of. So, he's always there in the background helping me out in that way.
Well, that will be really exciting, and I can't wait to see what you do next. So thank you so much as always, for a really enjoyable conversation. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. So don't forget to pick up a copy of Kathy Kacer's book, Under the Iron Bridge, from your local library or your local independent bookstore. And in the fall of 2022, you can look for Hidden on the High Wire. So enjoy the rest of your day, everybody, and be well. Thank you so much, Kathy.
Thanks, Gillian, and thanks, everyone.
It was fun.